So this is a labor not for one community. It's a labor for all of us. And it has to be now a shared story.
It feels good to be in solidarity with others. We talk about joy. I stand up for you. You stand up for me. That brings us joy.
Hello and welcome to the Joy Summit. Today's session is on resilience and joy in our individual and shared stories. I'm Doug Abrams, co-author of the Book of Joy, and I'm delighted to be your host. I am joined today by two wonderful guests, Bill Vendley and Pamela Yetunde, who are going to be discussing with us how the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives and the stories that we tell ourselves collectively impact the quality of our lives, the joy that we experience, the hope that we have in our lives. But first, I want to introduce Bill Vendley is the Vice President of World Religions and Spirituality for the Fetzer Institute. Before joining Fetzer, he was the Secretary General of Religions for Peace, the world's largest multi-religious organization. He also served as an advisor to President Obama on the Multi-Religious Cooperation and International Affairs Task Force for the White House Faith-Based Council. Pamela Yetunde is a pastoral counselor. She is also the author of Casting Indra's Net, Fostering Spiritual Kinship and Community, and co-editor of Black and Buddhist. Ayo, which means joy, is also the co-founder of the Center of the Heart. Thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, I am really excited to explore the topic of how the stories we tell ourselves influence the way that we live our lives and how we understand ourselves, how we understand our relationships with other people. And I'd love to begin with you and just hear a little about how you think about your own storytelling in your own life and how those stories impact the quality of your daily experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this question, Doug. I'm like everybody else, just trying to make it in this world, right? And trying to make sense of it and make sense of it for myself from a very young age. So we start telling ourselves stories before we even know that's what we're doing, just so that we can orient ourselves to the people around us, to the places we're in, and so on. And you're making me think about a very, very important story in my life, which has to do with the fact that my father died when I was 8 years old, and he was 35 years old. And
Wow,
in my
so
family, thank you. In my family, back in the olden days, if you will, children were to be seen and not heard, and that was a story. And so in that story that has major consequences, I was not talked to very much about my father's death and what it meant to me and what it meant to us as a family. It was almost as if we were not permitted to talk about it. And in that, then I made up my own stories about it and what it meant to me. And one of the compelling stories that I arrived at was, well, if my father died at 35, I will die at 35 too. That's what I thought. At the age of 8, I never expressed it, so it was never challenged until I was about 33 years old. And I was taking a walk with a good friend. We're just talking about life. And I said, well, there's some things that I've yet to do in this life, and I better do it soon because I don't think I'm going to be around much longer. And she was startled. Of course she was startled. And I told her, I said, my father died at 35. I'm 33. I've got 2 more years. And because she's a good friend, she just challenged me on that right away. And she said, first she began to laugh. And I was a little angry about that. But then she said, so let me understand this. How old is your mother? I think my mother was about 55 at the time. And she said, so by your logic, you could actually live another 20 years. And boom, that blew my story to pieces. And I think I really began living at the age of 33.
Wow.
By that story being challenged.
And wow, so how did your story, what was the new story you were living into, and how did that open up a different possibility for you.
Right. Well, the new story was life is mysterious. And no matter what I try to do to protect myself, to deal with my own existential angst, it's still mysterious. And you just don't know what is ahead of you. So go for it.
Mm.
Go for it.
Well, I'm hearing in that powerful story the ways in which we get these beliefs, and often dysfunctional beliefs, that we wrap our stories around and our expectations around, and our self-narratives around. And it seems like you were freed from that belief and that story, and it kind of shifted your whole way of experiencing your life in such a powerful way.
If I may, Doug, I'll just say
please
this
jump
in
in.
answer to your question. I think I began to rev it up, if you will. I've got some more living to do. The things that I didn't do, I can do now, and do them with a little more gusto rather than fear. Yeah.
No,
like catching
beautiful.
up on life.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I was meditating this week, and I was just struck by how much the what goes on inside of our head has very little connection to the reality of what goes on outside in the facts, so to speak. And obviously, as a Buddhist teacher, you spend a lot of time, I'm sure, helping people to not, believe what they think all the time, and to kind of come to terms with those beliefs and those stories that we tell ourselves that get in the way of our experiencing joy and possibility. Can you share with us a little bit about what you've learned on that journey to not believe your own thoughts, or to rework your own stories, or what you have learned from the Buddhist tradition or have taught your community? All of that is fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'll say, so I've got a multiple roles, one as a Buddhist leader and the other as a pastoral counselor. And the way we deal with stories in both of those roles are a little different. One, as a Buddhist teacher and leader, we often invite students to question the stories that they tell about themselves and tell about others. And one of the ways that we ask people to reflect on those stories and hold open the possibility that there's more to the story than what they know is through a teaching called dependent origination. In other words, nothing arises in and of itself. It is connected with something else that is connected with something else, and so on and so forth. Right. And so if you don't know those various connections, then you probably don't know the whole story. So the story that you have been holding, to try to hold it lightly and keep a mind and heart open to possibilities. Right. And also that your story is not you, and you are not your story. Even though there's a connection, they are not the same thing. As a pastoral counselor, I don't work to wrestle the story away from my clients. I listen for the strength in the story, the resilience in the story, and in particular, because of my particular background and research background, I listen for the ways we sabotage our dreams by the stories we tell, and then try to work within that.
Can you give us an example of perhaps somebody you worked with, or someone who was sabotaging their dreams, and kind of the process of helping them to free themselves from that story?
Mm-hmm. I'm chuckling because I'm thinking almost all of us do this.
Yes, of course.
Right.
That's why it's so powerful to hear. Yeah.
Right. Almost all of us do this. We believe that we are more limited than we actually are. I'll just mention one person right now, because, as a pastoral counselor, confidentiality is really important.
Of course, please.
Right. Really important. So I'll try to do a composite, if you will, a composite person, composite story, to say that there is someone I'm working with now who is working on self-forgiveness and forgiving their parent who died recently. Of course, their parent's death was not, no one knew exactly the day of the death, the day it would occur. And so this person had not planned on what they would say, what their final words to this parent would be. And so now they are left with, I wish I had said. And now I can't say it because they can't hear it. And what am I to do with this? Not only what am I to do with this, but what is happening is that it is the material, if you will, for shame. So the shame is taking hold in this person. If I had been a better person, I would, and here's the story. If I had been a better person, if I had lived up to my deepest values, I would have been there for my father to share my last words with him. And that brings me to the story in your book, The Book of Joy, when Archbishop Desmond Tutu talks about what he wished he had said to his father, and the pain that he had to carry in his life because of the unresolved issues there. So just being able to say, this is what I'm working with, to be able to say it with to someone who is not going to shame that person. Yes, you should have been other than who you actually are. To remind that person that they are not their shame. Yeah, we all have misgivings, things that go unresolved, and to work on self-forgiveness, self-compassion, and self-forgiveness.
You know, the forgiveness is such a powerful way in which we free ourselves and unchain ourselves from the past or from those stories and those identities. You mentioned the story about Archbishop Tutu wanting to forgive himself for not forgiving his father. And just so for those who haven't read the book, just to mention that story briefly, it's a very powerful story that Arch told us when we were in Dharamsala about how his father, when he was a little boy, used to beat his mother, and it was a source of enormous pain and suffering in his life. And he was visiting his father, and while he was taking his kids to school in Lesotho, or Swaziland, I think it was, because they couldn't get an education in South Africa because education for blacks was basically menial education. And he stopped off to see his father, and his father said he wanted to speak with him, and he was exhausted, and he was going to his wife Leia's parents to sleep for the night. He said, "Dad, can we just speak in the morning?" And the next morning he was woken by a call that said that his father had died. And he always wondered whether his father was wanting to ask for forgiveness or apologize for what he had done to his mom, and that he had not given him that opportunity. And I think what he learns from that powerful story is just, we never know how much time we have with anyone, and we never know when we're going to have our final chance for forgiveness. And I think, as you said, also self-forgiveness is a crucial part of releasing ourselves from those stories as well. I think we say often that forgiveness is giving up the desire for a different past. And just accepting the past that we had and the reality of our experience. And maybe this is an interesting way to segue to you, Bill, for a second, and talk a little bit about the stories that we share, because obviously our individual stories often come out of this, the familial stories, as Ayo was saying, they come out of our religious traditions, they come out of our societies. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about, because this is, I know, something that you've been very focused on in terms of how we transform the collective stories that we tell. And maybe the place to begin is kind of why is that work so important for you, and why is that work so important to us?
Well, thanks, Doug. It's a real joy to be here, and I love listening to my friend Ayo and her wisdom as she shares. So I think what I could start with is just reflecting how what Ayo shared is also true collectively. I'd like to share that a good part of my life was dealing with communities in conflict, civil wars, really starting in Bosnia and then moving around the world and country after country where there was conflict. And in each case, you had a community with a story, and it was a story that was very centered on both what they thought they were entitled to and grievances that they had suffered. And there were always people working those stories, if I can put it that way, lifting up, in many cases, the grievance side, how this community was dealt unjustly, and how there was ample evidence, tragic, painful evidence of suffering, of cruelty, of injustice. And that story then could become almost a limiting story. And to be honest, Doug, I would go to one community and they would share with me their grievance and show me the photographs of people who had been killed, had been tortured, would wait to see if they could feel that I was truly empathizing with them. And that was the sort of signal that I would be in the game with them. But almost immediately they'd pivot or lace that sharing of suffering with enmity for the other. Could I also be captured in their seemingly righteous hatred of the community that had so injured them? The next day I would be with the other community and I'd experience almost the same thing. Their extraordinary grievance, literally the photographs of people killed and tortured and so forth. And the sort of question, how could I not be with them, including their being hostile to anybody who had done these things for them? So part of the extraordinary labor that these communities had to do, and their religious communities were often front runners in this labor, would be to build a new story, one that could bear the presence of the other, could include the possibility of forgiveness and of healing. Very difficult. I've literally had religious leaders meeting in secret say to me, Bill, we're trusting you. I'll be shot dead in 2 hours if this meeting is known, and I'll be shot dead by my own community. They'll see me as treacherously selling them out, selling short their suffering. So these beautiful people, both communities, trapped in a certain way, being egged on by people who would profit by that conflict, but even within their own communities, groping, searching to find an honest new story big enough to hold both of these communities, or both segments of these communities, big enough to hold Bosnians, Serbians, Croatians, Jews in that case, but also in case after case, these subpopulations. And the extraordinary thing, and it really resonates powerfully with something Ayo shared, which was so elegant. And she described how she has a different way of approaching story as a Buddhist and as a pastoral counselor. And as a Buddhist, she said something quite extraordinary. We know that we're just not our stories. If I'm going to put it in my words, Ayo, we're kind of simultaneously story bound and story beyond. And the fact that we can change our stories, Doug shows us that we're sort of in a story, but beyond that story at the same time. And so I would witness and was privileged to work with communities in conflict in many continents that would find the courage to both be in a story and then be beyond that story in order to build a new and better story. If we're story bound, it means we always have a story. It may not be the right story. It may not be an adequate story. And so what Io encounters pastorally and on person to person is also true communally. And we've got to find the ways to help each other as communities, often divided communities, to reach beyond our narrow stories and build together a fuller, richer story that can hold us together.
Oh, that's very powerful. You're sparking many things for me, but I wanted to ask Io if there was anything that sparked for you and what Bill said before I launch in.
It's true what he's saying. Bill, you're reminding me of a time long ago when I was an asylum officer with the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And our role as an asylum officer was to determine whether the person or the people who had applied for asylum in the States, whether they were making a credible case. Had they been persecuted, or if they were to go back to their country of origin, did they have a reasonable fear that they would be persecuted upon their arrival? And we had to, in part, determine the story that they were telling, the story that was being told by others about where they were from, the reasons for those stories. And it was a story upon story upon story before we could make a determination as to whether they had established a credible fear. And our survival, I believe, Bill, our survival depends exactly on what you're talking about.
And going beyond going beyond those stories. Yeah, it's making me think of several things. I mean, I think the sense that we often live in stories where we're living a life that is happening to us, as opposed to by us, so that we're living a story of victimhood, basically, of, things. I think personally, this is one of the great challenges for us, is that, is whenever we see, and it's not to say that people aren't victimized and that there isn't great violence and suffering that others, that is perpetrated on communities, which is certainly the case. But what I hear you say is when we start getting identified with that story of persecution or victimhood, either individually or collectively, we, our potential, our ability to see our shared humanity, for one, or even the whole possibility of our own humanity, becomes dramatically diminished. And I think one of the things that's so extraordinary about Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama is here are two of the great social activists of the 20th century. They are two of the people who lead communities that have experienced enormous suffering. In the case of Archbishop Tutu, the apartheid oppression of blacks and other people of color in South Africa. In Tibet, obviously, the invasion of the Chinese and the exile of the Dalai Lama's community. And yet, their ability to hold on to the humanity of those who others would see as their enemy or their oppressors was truly startling. And I remember Arch telling me that he would pray every day during the riots and the shootings and everything for the well-being of the leaders of the apartheid state, and that ability to have compassion and to kind of hold on to their humanity, he said, allowed him to be able to work with them to the transformation of his nation in a way that if he had demonized them or villainized them, even if they're, what they had done was, villainous, But that ability to hold on to that compassion, and similarly for the Dalai Lama, I mean, I think his ability to separate out, kind of, the Chinese perpetrators of the oppression from the Chinese people, or even the Chinese leaders and government more generally. I mean, that nuance, that ability to kind of see those distinctions, I just think it's so powerful, both in terms of our collective stories that we're talking about now, and also for our personal stories, because we are often telling a kind of hero, victim, villain story about our own lives as well.
And the more you hear the story, the more you tend to believe it. I think that's one thing that we are learning from the authoritarian leaders today. If we've been studying the stories that they tell it over and over and over again. It goes from being false to true, and people then act on it. And it's so unfortunate, because we've seen this over and over and over in our lifetimes. We can avoid many of the tragedies that have occurred in our lifetimes, but we're not always aware of how mesmerized and hypnotized we're becoming by the repetitiveness of a false story.
I think, having worked with Jane Goodall and on the Book of Hope, and with a lot of scientists, neuroscientists, I think a lot about just the fundamental mechanisms of the human brain, and how we have, what episodic memory, which is, something happens in our life and we encode that as an episode, and then we have autobiographical memory, which is when we link those episodes together and tell stories about our life, and that's where our identity comes from. And it seems like, in some ways, that autobiographical memory, or that communal memory, can become rigid. And it makes me think of this powerful thing that Archbishop Tutu said about how suffering can ennoble us, or it can embitter us. And it ennobles us when we make meaning out of it and use it to help others. And what I would say is also kind of what I'm hearing in this conversation, when we don't cling to it as, and we are allowed, he said something about, like, when we're witnessing suffering, we need to witness suffering like a dishwasher, not a vacuum cleaner. We need to, like, wash all that's, the pain off and then send it through the pipes. We can't hold on to it like a vacuum cleaner. And so it seems like part of what we're talking about is that when our stories become rigid, and our identity as a kind of victim of a certain suffering, or a certain heartbreak or hardship, then we start to ossify in some way, or to retract in our ability to meet life freshly, and to see life without those filters. And just to come back to what you were just saying about, I think, kind of the conspiracy theories and the totalitarian stories that are being told in our nation and around the world. Now, it's like the human imagination is extraordinary, and we can believe a whole variety of things. And many of them have, as we were started from, in this conversation, have very little to do with the actual facts or the reality. So the more we can keep those, recognize that our storytelling may not be the only story that can be told, the more free we are to see life more freshly.
It's sort of, if I would say it in my way, it's sort of, Doug, and I think it's a very deep point you're making. It begins to become a limit of our ability to perceive. If the story is the story of grievance, then we see, and it's, whether it's communal or personal, then we're going to see the entire field of our experience through that story, and we'll miss all sorts of radiant experiences that are actually there. They're just not perceived. And so part of, I'm sure, what IO does in pastoral counseling and And what we would do in intercommunal conflict is to bring what seems almost counterfactual. She had to have a friend challenge her in her story by talking about the age of her mother. And so that didn't fit with the way Io had arranged her story. Similarly, if you're within communities that are conflicting, you've got to bring the evident goodness of the people within the other community, their innocence, their suffering, ultimately what would bring you in solidarity with this other community, even if you would still decry the violence and the cruelty that in fact has taken place, but isn't the whole story. And so I think your point is exactly right, that the story becomes the filter for what you can attend to, and therefore the question about story becomes the question about an ever more adequate story. And even the humility to say that we'll always be refining our stories as we go along, say.
That's really beautifully said, Bill. And it makes me think about the fact that we're constantly asking, is this person an us or a them in our minds? And, this goes back, probably to our very, very early experience as a species, and even but there's this kind of approach or avoid kind of instinct that we have. And, one of the things that was so shocking to see is that the empathic resonance circuits of the brain do not light up when we see harm being done to somebody that we think is other, kind of part of that other group that you're talking about in those conflict situations. And so it seems like part of the role of a collective story is to take us beyond those conflicts that we have, or those divisions, or these Republican and Democrat, or Ukrainian and Russian, and to see some what Arch called shared humanity beyond those divisions, beyond the people that we think are like us or not like us, or friend or foe in our life. And I'd be interested, both in the collective level and in the personal level, to hear kind of what does that look like to reach for a story that is more founded on Ubuntu or shared humanity or interdependence or co-arising, as you were saying, Io, that allows us to be free of that kind of sense of division of black and white, enemy and friend.
I'm waiting on Bill.
Okay. So we live in an extraordinary time, and we have we now know we are a single human family. We can't avoid it. We live on a little blue, beautiful earth, and in the most hideous examples, people do challenge whether we're all human beings, but those are extreme. We know that when we see a person, that is a person, like myself. So today, I think the truly extraordinary thing is often not the headline in the news. The news is conflict. The news is conflict between religious groups. But the headline is that all around the world, at the village level, at all sorts of higher levels of organization, I'm going to speak now about the religious communities. They are beginning to encounter each other, to stand shoulder to shoulder, to recognize a profound difference of paths into the sacred, but that path into the sacred gives them each in their own terms a radical ground for solidarity in love, in compassion. It's a solidarity in joy. Look at the Arch and the Dalai Lama and the literal joy that both of them had with each other. That's a kind of revolution that's taking place that is both honoring the long history of the human family, which has been telling itself sacred tales from its first human conversation, to a point where we're not homogenizing our milk, but we are recognizing that these diverse paths into sacred mystery, using that term for however the tradition speaks about the ultimate, is the very ground for solidarity with each other, and solidarity with each other for a kind of shared flourishing, a relational flourishing. And that's the beauty that we're all experiencing. This is happening across the world in the religious communities. It's rather underreported in the news because the news is more sensational. Sweetness of a representative of one religion gently nudging another and saying, you understand me better than many in my own community. Not a statement that he or she was unconvinced of the radical truth of their own tradition, but a recognition that the other person was seized by sacred mystery, had been matured into an experience of the sacred, of love, of joy, of compassion. And good sees good, and love sees love, and compassion sees compassion wherever it lies. And so this profound recognition of each other across our differences, and each finding an experience of ultimacy as the grounds for solidarity, is the exquisite opportunity for our human family today. And we see signs of our human family reaching up to it. There are other very distressing signs, but we see this happening. I'm sure Ayo has seen it again and again, and I've seen it again and again, that from the village level to senior leaders like Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama, they're finding solidarity rooted in their most profound sacred experiences.
So let me kind of sharpen the point a little bit,
yeah.
because I am relating to what you're saying by the experience of kind of sitting with Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama was like sitting at the mountaintop where all the world's religions converge. And what was there was this extraordinary compassion and joy and that you're speaking about. So let's say I am a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, Buddhist, listening to this conversation. I have my own sacred story from my tradition. But what does how does my story shift in such a way that allows us to come together as a shared humanity?
So there is, in storying, a lot of hidden wealth, and the wealth comes into view depending on our circumstances. So what happens, I think, is that today, very frequently, people who have long been separated previously by maybe different religious identities now find themselves facing the same set of challenges to our human family. The environmental crisis is the obvious one, but every dimension of our flourishing is a common challenge today. There simply are no barriers that are high enough to wall us off from the vulnerability of the other. That vulnerability comes back and is really a vulnerability to all of us in the end. So people are experiencing this. They're experiencing it in pandemics. They're experiencing it in all sorts of challenges, and the communities are coming together to collaborate together. They're not asking, initially they don't ask anything more than, do you agree that your tradition invites you morally to be concerned about this problem? So a kind of ethical framework is the original way that they agree to come together. But once they've worked shoulder to shoulder, that's not the full description. They fall in love with each other. They literally have the experience of beholding beauty in the other. And once they've done that, that provides an opportunity to go back and look at their own tradition and find evidence that they've overlooked. They see the Buddhists doing something that they find utterly attractive. And they go back, say, as a Muslim, or they go back as a Christian, and they say, well, what do I have in my own tradition that's perhaps not in the forefront at the moment that I bring back? And a kind of virtuous cycle begins. Goodness calls forth goodness. And we're all standing shoulder to shoulder on this common problem. I see that they're committed to it. I see what they bring to it. And I'm inspired to welcome that, but also almost through looking through their own eyes, seeing my own tradition for beauty and wealth that my own tradition may have neglected to fully develop. And so this is a kind of mutual mediation that takes place. Just like in a good relationship, you bring an act of goodness and it's reciprocated by another act of goodness. This dynamic can happen across communities themselves, and it becomes a kind of mutually transforming dynamic. And so oddly, challenges are helping these historic communities. Challenges that are confronting all of us are helping these historic communities to rise in a kind of solidarity of care. That solidarity of care begins to alter the way they experience their own sacred tradition. They begin to see it more fully and more deeply. So this is, again, I think, the undertold, celebrated drama of our own moment in time that I've heard again and again. The religious personalities of all different levels, from grassroots to senior, saying that they were now more profoundly Jewish, or more profoundly Muslim, more profoundly Christian, more profoundly indigenous, because they had collaborated and fallen in love with people who were of other traditions whom they took seriously. So it's a really extraordinary possibility that I think all of us are being invited to lean into. And it's a different question, but it's happening in a different way in science as well. So we can come to that when that's appropriate. But
well, it's interesting. I'm brought back to this sense that if we the hardening of the categories, the hardening of the arteries of our, humanity, when we are exposed to these other communities, when we're open to these other communities, we see that shared humanity in a way that enriches and deepens and allows us to get out of, to challenge some of the stories or the truths that we have clung to in an absolutist form, right? And I think one of the things, it was so beautiful and gorgeous to see the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Tutu participate in each other's traditions, and and it was such an extraordinary example of that sense that these, beautiful religious traditions that we have developed over our long history are these ways in which we have learned to flourish and to express ourselves and to find meaning and purpose and ritual and practice, and that they are part of the panoply of our human experience to be shared with one another. And it comes back, I guess it brings me back to something I want you to touch on, Io, which is kind of because it's hard, there's something about our cognition that wants to be right, that wants to be certain. And we abhor ambivalence, uncertainty, nuance, those things are very challenging to us. So we want to believe our stories. We want to believe our rightness. We want to believe that our villains are our villains, our enemies are our enemies. Take us into your practice, and how do you try to reimagine those categories or that storytelling that happens in your own mind in a way that leaves you free to experience more joy in your life?
Mm-hmm. Whew. I'm breathing because I was listening very closely to the two of you in your exchange, and so many things were popping off in my head that I can hardly
Please.
concentrate on the question
Sure.
that you
Oh,
just
sure.
posed.
Go there first. Go for
I
that
don't know if
first.
I
We'll come
can.
back to it.
Well, first, I guess, first of all, I want to say that we do have an appetite for the sensational. So we get what we ask for, we get what we pay for. And I was wondering if we'd be willing to take a diet or be on a diet from that and cultivate a taste, a flavor, an appetite for the positive, for the stories that aren't being reported. I began to think about Oprah Winfrey back in the olden days when she was basically doing what other talk show hosts were doing, which was focusing on the sensational. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was Maya Angelou or what, but something happened to Oprah and she let that go. And she decided to embrace the positive and generosity. And I think it's fair to say that she did well as as the result of that. We could use her as an example. What does it mean to let go of the sensational and embrace the good? Bill was saying love sees love and compassion sees compassion. And I believe that's been proven by neuroscientists that when we see people acting with compassion, we want to do it. We just want to do that, right? We believe we can do it. And so we then try to do it. It helps us cultivate courage to see other people loving others and expressing compassion towards another. So let me see if I can answer your question real briefly, Doug, and just say that as a person who grew up in the early 60s in the conservative state of Indiana, as a Black person, and then later as a queer person, I've had to examine many stories that were said, and as a woman, many stories, even one coming from my mother about what women could do, the limits on a woman's work life. She was limited to 3 professions, perhaps. What Black people can do, because white people won't let you do XYZ, so you have your limits there. And clearly, as a queer person, you can't love and you can't be in a long-term relationship because you're not capable. You're not capable of doing that. Psychological sciences have shown that you're not capable of that. So I've had to do a lot of work around coming to the belief that I can do many more things and that I am many more things than the stories society has created and gifted me, if you will, with. And that's what we all have to do in our own ways, in our own ways. One last thing I want to say about the beauty of watching His Holiness the Dalai Lama participate in communion and Archbishop Desmond Tutu participating in Buddhist ritual. People who are still engaged in religious practices in religious communities, I think would do very well for our collective survival, would do very well to really shift our attention away from the practices that exclude people towards the stories that include people. The power of these traditions have largely been around people saying, oh, this particular prophet, this particular founder, this particular leader is showing us a way to understand who we are and who others are in a way that no one has done that before. And then we open our hearts and open our arms, right? But also within these traditions are practices that are exclusive. And we have to make a decision what we're going to focus on. And I hope that for our survival, we will focus on the inclusion and not the exclusion.
And that there are leaders in every tradition that see the shared humanity and that inclusion. And there are leaders in every community and tradition that see the exclusion and the separation and the exceptionalism and the division and promote that. And that at the core of each of our traditions is a human shared humanity and connection and recognition of our our similarities are greater than our differences. You sparked so many things. I know we're coming to a close here, but I wanted to just add that, the Dalai Lama and Arch were adamant about how the news is the aberration, it's the exception of what's happening on planet Earth. And, as the Dalai Lama said it, like if when you look at the news, you think that our nature is to be corrupt or to rape or to kill, and then there's not much hope. But that actually, when you realize that on what's happening on the Earth, most of the time is an incredible amount of love from parents to children, from teachers to children, from people nurturing and caring for people in hospitals, or there's just so much more collective shared collaboration than there is cruelty and harshness. And there's something that Jane Goodall taught me when we were working on the Book of Hope, which kind of blew my mind, which was, I said, are we 51% good or are we 51% evil? And she said, well, I think we're split down the middle, and what determines which way we go is our environment. And what that did for me was help me see that all the things that we lament around our vice, our aggressiveness, our violence, our cruelty, in some contexts, that actually helped us survive, or we wouldn't have held on to it. And so really the work is to be creating communities, families, societies, a world where those better angels of our nature are encouraged, what we in the religious tradition call the virtues as opposed to the vices, are allowed to flourish and to predominate. And we're in a battle for the human imagination right now. I mean, we're in, whether you want to call it a battle or a wrestling match, are we this selfish, cruel species that is destined to destroy the earth and go extinct? Or are we the most cooperative and creative species that has ever lived on this planet, and who can come together to meet those challenges of our time, and to have the possibility of not only solving, the kind of crises that we face as a species, but in terms of our Earth. And, you're right. Those challenges that Bill, you were mentioning are also the opportunity. And what the Dalai Lama said was, you can turn great challenges into great opportunities. And it seems like we're being presented with that opportunity to come up with a way of understanding ourselves and seeing our collective story in a way that allows us to move forward together on this planet.
Well said.
Doug, may I just say this?
Please.
We're both, aren't we? Aren't we the species that can destroy this planet and the species that can help maintain it and protect it? Aren't we both?
And it seems like we are both. I think that's what Jane was saying by 50-50. Mm-hmm. And I think what determines which way we go are those stories that we tell ourselves. Do we tell ourselves that we are kind of that doomed, cruel, violent species, and it's everybody against everybody? Or do we tell ourselves the story of our human possibility and our collective potential to create a world where there's room for everyone, and we can safeguard the planet on which we all depend. And I think at a personal level, it's the same. It's like, it's at the macro level or the micro level. It's like, what story do we tell ourselves about our life? Do we tell ourselves a story of threat and scarcity, or do we tell ourselves a story of love and possibility?
We're in the process, I think, of trying to work together, all of us contributing. This Joy Summit is a critical pebble in the big labor to find a true shared sacred story, a story that would truly allow us in all of our differences to be united even more profoundly than our differences. And I think that's the labor of our time. Go back to Ayo's observation, we are story bound and story beyond. And it's the story beyondness that helps us to labor to build the new story that we all need, that's going to embrace us all. So I think we are given that possibility. And we need each other in order to realize that possibility. So this is a labor not for one community. It's a labor for all of us. And it has to be now a shared story. And I believe a shared sacred story in which our traditions are honored, but we are in solidarity. That's, I think, who we are called to be.
Oh, that reminds me. One other thing I want to say about solidarity. It feels good to be in solidarity with others.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk
Mm-hmm.
about joy, one of the things that brings us joy is the feeling of knowing I've got your back, you've got mine. We are in this together. I love you, you love me. Right? That's solidarity. I stand up for you, you stand up for me. That brings us joy.
I think that the bottom line from the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu was that our greatest joy is our relationships with one another, and that solidarity is a crucial piece of those relationships. And the topic that we are exploring is joy and resilience from our stories, and I think that is that solidarity, that sense of shared humanity, that sense of challenging our individual stories and even our collective stories and where they may no longer be serving us, that allows us to free our minds and our hearts to greater joy and resilience. And I just want to thank you, Ayo and Bill, so much for this fantastic conversation, and thank everyone for listening in. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on these topics and to working with you to create a story of our humanity that can help us thrive in the crucial decades ahead. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, dear.